Here to break down the media component of the race is Tim Murtaugh, the director of communications for the 2020 Trump campaign. Tim, we see polls coming out right now from both Reuters, Ipsos, and Fox News showing at the very moment President Trump is trailing Joe Biden in some key swing states, one of which being Michigan, also Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Do you put any weight into these polls right now, or is it too early to be making these type of determinations?
It's way too early for that. And we know how notoriously bad public polls have been regarding Donald Trump. And certainly those polls don't reflect what we see internally. And we know it's important to remember that there are still more than 6.5 months left to go in this race. And we've only just now learned that Joe Biden is likely to be President Trump's opponent rather. And we know that we have not even really begun to define Joe Biden on his past record and his proposals for the future. And once we do that, you'll see those numbers dramatically change. For example, voters will be informed that Joe Biden opposes and for a long time opposed the travel restrictions that President Trump put in place on China. And once people learn about that, they move very much in the president's direction. And we'll also tell voters about how President Trump made America the #1 energy producer in the world, and contrast that with Joe Biden's just incredible embrace of the Green New Deal, eliminating the fossil fuel industry, placing heaps of regulations on American businesses. Those are the people who create the jobs, and it would drive energy bills sky high, heating and cooling bills for people across this country. Once voters find out about that stuff, they will move in Donald Trump's direction. And once we begin to engage, remember, Joe Biden has yet to run through a general election and tangle with Donald J. Trump. And believe me, when that happens, you'll see those numbers dramatically change.
And I think you bring up an interesting point there, because Biden is seeing this surge, if you will, at a time when people aren't seeing him. He hasn't been making that many media appearances. He's been in the basement of his Delaware studio at his home. And people really haven't been getting that face-to-face contact, seeing those type of debates that we were seeing before. And it's kind of interesting that it's coming at a time when he is seeing a surge in the polls, at a time when people are not seeing him. So to that point that you're making right now, once debates start taking off, do you think that's when really the Trump administration, or the Trump campaign, I should say, is going to pull away from the Biden campaign?
Well, there's many ways to define your opponent. Debates are certainly one. Paid advertising is another. And through the earned media and through things that we do from the campaign that are not actual paid advertisements, there's a lot of different ways you can define your opponent. And I think maybe Joe Biden is benefiting from people not seeing him too much, because when he does pop his head out, these interviews, even though they're softball interviews and with very, very friendly hosts, he does terribly. You can see him when he looks down at his notes. He's using notes, which most people don't do for television interviews. And even when he's doing that, he loses his train of thought. We'll remind people that he was a terrible candidate the first 2 times he ran for president, and he's even worse now. And so once people get a load of how bad Joe Biden really is, those numbers will shift again.
No, I think you're right. And I think it's also interesting to see, for example, the Trump campaign really taking aim at his ties to China. It's something that doesn't only meet the moment right now, but it has broader effects than that. Because, for example, when you were talking about the Ukraine allegations against President Trump, a lot of people then pointing the finger at Joe Biden and his son Hunter's ties to Ukraine. But those are the same type of allegations that exist even with China as well. So when it comes to those ties, is that more of a long game as well compared to just a strategy at right now to meet the moment?
Oh, you'll be hearing about China throughout the election, no question of that. For the longest time, Joe Biden has been soft on China. He was all in favor of them being admitted to the World Trade Organization. He thought that they were no threat whatsoever to the United States as an economic competitor. He likened their economy to that of Norway. And so, he had no idea what he was doing. And now we see that he was critical of the president's attack on China for their cheating on the international trade market and bringing China to the table and standing up to them. He was against that. He didn't want President Trump to identify China as the point of origin for the coronavirus outbreak. And as you mentioned, Hunter Biden, that's an issue that is going to be with Joe Biden throughout this election. As we know, he enriched himself personally, Hunter Biden did, with his business deals in Ukraine and with China. With the state-controlled Chinese bank investing in his firm, Hunter Biden got that money while his father was the vice president of the United States. You better believe we'll be talking about those issues.
And I think we can already see that a lot of legacy media outlets, even the mainstream ones, are a little bit more favorable to Joe Biden, the same way that they're more favorable to Hillary Clinton in 2016. How do you combat that? Is it with a more effort behind the digital strategy, more direct type of communication through Twitter? How do you combat that?
Well, first, we think that every time the news media goes into a frenzy like that, it actually does themselves more harm than it could ever do to President Trump. And I don't think that the national news media has learned any lessons from 2016. They were badly wrong in 2016, if you can just remember the long faces on election night in November 2016. And they're getting it wrong again. And, the president takes them on for a couple of hours every day in the coronavirus briefings, and Americans can see the ridiculous gotcha questions that they're asking. And the media, as President Trump is leading this nation in the war against the coronavirus, and that's what this is, it's a war, the media and Joe Biden have set themselves up as the opposition in that war. Imagine that. Imagine that. They're actually opposing the president of the United States as he tries to lead the nation into a crisis situation. And so, I think that Americans can see what's going on there. We at the campaign try to amplify that. We do through press releases and social media posts as often as the examples pop up. So I just think that the media does itself damage and a disservice to the American people every time they do that, which sadly is daily.
No, and polls show exactly what you're saying. The American people are very much so on board with the response to this pandemic from basically every facet of American life, whether it be the president, Vice President Mike Pence, the public health officials, governors. Basically everyone has a positive approval rating amid this, except for the media. So I think you're right to say that, and I think it's a problem that they're going to have to overcome going into November as well. But Tim Murtaugh, always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks very much for breaking down the elections of 2020.